this is Cam Logan, and I was going to write a blog post with pictures, but life is a little crazy, so I'll introduce you to Emma this way. This is our newest little one, and she is not 2 weeks yet. I don't like putting exact birthdays online of my kids, but so she's itty bitty, and we've been having a lot of fun with her, and she's been a huge blessing. She's jaundiced, so we've been dealing with extra doctor's appointments with that. They're not super concerned, but they want to just make sure she's losing the yellow and that she's being healthy that way. So wanted everybody to kind of meet her and tell you a little bit about her birth story if she'll let me, if she doesn't start fussing here in a minute. But at any rate, so I was excited to have her born. I think I'm technically at what my due date was. My due date was September 18th, so 2 days from now would have been my due date. And she's almost, she's not almost 2 weeks old, but she's, ish there. But, so she was born a little early, but she was 7 pounds and 11 ounces, so certainly not too small or anything. And it was one of those things where they had given me a couple of due dates, and I didn't really know when she would be born. I was thinking probably a week and a half before my actual due date, and that turned out to be what it was, so that was exciting. But my husband and I were still kind of blindsided when I went into labor. I just thought like, oh yeah, I'm just having little practice contractions, nothing's going to happen tonight. And I wound up having a baby. It was funny because my contractions were about 5 minutes apart. My husband and I were watching some Warehouse 13 on Netflix, and I would just get on all fours every time I'd have a contraction because they were starting to hurt a little bit. And I had read that when you get on, all fours, it kind of helps position the baby. So I figured if it was the real thing, hopefully it would speed up the labor. And so every contraction while I'm watching Warehouse 13 with my husband, I'm getting on all fours, and he's taking my Kindle, and he just kind of looked at me, so he'd get on all fours next to me and put the Kindle underneath my face so I could still watch the show. And it was about 10:30 at night. I just told my husband, you know what, just go to sleep. Because the contractions were spacing out. They had gone from 5 minutes apart to about 7 minutes apart. And I said, I don't think this is it because they're spacing out again. Don't worry about it. The thing of it was the contractions were a little bit painful, and I couldn't sleep through them. And normally, with some of the practice contractions, you can sleep through them, but I wasn't able to at all. And again, I started doing things that I knew would hopefully speed labor along if it was the real thing. And I was walking through contractions. I had read a blog post by another mom who went through a couple of natural births, and she did a couple things like swaying with contractions and just a couple of positions to walk in or rock in, and she even suggested getting on the toilet and dealing with contractions on the toilet and all of that. So I tried a couple of different things for about an hour and a half, and then all of a sudden they went from 7 minutes, 5 minutes apart to 2 minutes apart. And they were a lot more painful. So I woke up my husband, we called my mother, she came over to watch the kids. And by this time, normally when I'd driven to the hospital in the past with my husband, I was not super far gone when it came to pain, but this time my husband would try to talk to me, and the contractions were coming pretty close together, and he'd try to talk to me, and I'd just be like, just drive, just go. Like, don't ask me anything. Are you in pain? Yes, I am. Just go. And he was frustrated because, of course, to him it seemed like he was hitting every red light. I wasn't even paying attention to that at that point. And before we got in the car to go to the hospital, we realized that his car was on absolute fumes. So while we're waiting for my mother to come over to our house, which is about a 5-minute drive, he's like, well, should I go and get gas right now? And I'm thinking, okay, do I want to be at home alone with 3 kids and possibly have this baby right here? But I didn't feel like I was that far gone in labor, so I said, yes, just go, get gas, and he beat my mother back to the house, and then, you know, we got off on our way. We get to the hospital, and I figured, because all my other kids, when I had them, I got to the hospital and I was maybe 3 or 4 centimeters dilated, and that was it. I wasn't very far along in labor with any of them, and I labored for probably about at least 12 hours. I think my shortest labor in the hospital, with the exception of her, was 12 hours. I had one labor where I spent about 12 hours in the hospital, but I was also laboring for about 12 hours at home. That was my first. So it was a nice 24-hour thing, but at any rate, so I assumed we'd be hanging out there for a while, and I get to the hospital, and they say, one, I was 6 centimeters dilated, and I said, okay, and they said, do you want an epidural? And I said, it depends on the anesthesiologist, because some of them on staff there will not give me an epidural because I have a bleeding disorder, and they're just not comfortable with it, and I had a little bit of a low platelet count anyway. And sure enough, the anesthesiologist on duty that night was one of the more conservative ones, and he wasn't willing to give me an epidural. And they said, well, there's nothing really we can do for you because you're going to have this baby in 4 hours, and we don't want to give you any narcotics because she might wind up in the NICU and we might have to detox her. And I was like, oh, okay. So I knew there was a distinct possibility of having to go through a natural childbirth with this little one. So I had been doing a lot of reading on natural childbirth, even though ideally I wanted an epidural, or ideally I wanted Dilaudid, but at that point I was too close to having this one. And the nurses were great. They just said to me, oh, you're going to have this baby so soon, and you're not, you know, not a big deal. And they were absolutely supportive. And the nurse I had actually never left my room, which was such a huge blessing, because for me, I love, you know, my husband's there with me, he's supporting me, but to have a nurse right there the entire time that I was in labor was, I can't even describe what a relief it was for me. And I know the reason why she was there was because I was so far along. But by the time they checked me again, I was already in transition. And at that point, you know, the thought of getting up and trying different laboring positions to relieve pain or to speed things along just wasn't on my radar, because transition is really painful and I didn't want to move, so I just stayed in the hospital bed. And they had called my doctor the second I got into the hospital, and she was on her way. But essentially they told me, they're like, well, what's going to happen is we'll break your water as soon as your doctor gets here, and when we break your water, it's going to be time to push. Because I was that far along, and I told them, I said, I don't want to push if I don't feel like I need to. They're like, the baby's there. You're gonna, as soon as we break your water, you're going to feel the need to push. And they were right, and my doctor strolled in, and they broke my water, and she was born within minutes of my doctor even getting there. And from the time I got to the hospital and checked in to the time she was born, it was only an hour and a half. And what was so funny is I have had 2 labors with an epidural, and I have had 1 labor with Dilaudid, and then Emma was a completely natural labor. So I've experienced, you know, all 3 ways you can do it, I guess. And with my 2 epidural labors, the epidural, I don't know if it was my body and the way it reacted to the medicine. I don't know if it was the hospital's mentality to not give too much epidural so you can feel pushing. But by the time I got to transition, it was painful. It was I had very painful labors with my epidurals once I got to transition. Now, the epidural took the pain away completely when I was, you know, just between, like, I think I waited until I was 5 centimeters for the epidural, but it did take away the pain completely for a long time. But then when it got to that transition and then that pushing again, it's like the epidural had completely worn off, or the way my body reacted to it, it wasn't strong enough, or whatever the case may be. And then with the Dilaudid, same thing. It took the edge off for the beginning part of labor, but once it got to transition, they couldn't give me more. I could have requested it, but again, that's risking a baby in the NICU. And again, transition and pushing was very, very painful. And in a lot of ways, this labor was the least painful out of all three, because I had gone through those transitions and that pushing stages with the other ones. And I think because they were longer labors, even though the pain was dulled, and even though the pain had been completely taken away with the 2 epidural labors for hours, my muscles were still doing the work. And so when that pain came again, it really, really hurt. So in some ways, this was by far, even though it was natural, it was the easiest labor I had, simply by virtue of how short it was. And she is my 4th baby, so unfortunately, I don't think a first-time mom's going to get this lucky. And I definitely didn't get lucky as a 2nd or a 3rd-time mom with a short labor. So it was a huge blessing. And the second she was born, all I could just say was, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus, because it was over. And one of the things with this labor that I had really tried to get in the mindset for was the fact that it wasn't going to kill me. Because in my previous labors, once I had reached that transition stage, and maybe it was just because I had pain medication and it wore off, but in my previous labors with the transition stage, I just had this horrible, horrible fear the entire time that I was just going to die with my 3 previous labors. And it was one of those things that I know it was an irrational fear. I know I was in a hospital. I know I had doctors who knew what they were doing. I knew I wasn't high risk, but I just had this horrible, horrible fear that I was just going to die in all 3 of my previous labors. So in this one, I really tried to enter into it with a lot of prayer, and I worked my way through the contractions with a lot of prayer, and I give God the glory, because this time I wasn't nearly as fearful, and I think that had a lot to do with me managing my pain as well, because fear just intensifies things. So that would be my birth story of sweet little Emma here, and I think she's getting hungry, so I'll have to stop for now. I might write all of this down eventually, but at this point I was planning on writing it down in the first place, but unfortunately with new baby and everything going on, I was busy, and when you write it down, you have to edit it and make it look good and all of that stuff. So decided just to do a video. If you have any questions for me about anything, feel free to ask. I know preparing for this birth, I read a lot of birth stories, because that was just, I needed to know that there were other women who had made it through a natural childbirth okay and lived to tell about it. So I know birth stories were a huge help to me. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments, and I'll see if I can answer them. And I didn't want to get too detailed with everything, but we had a wonderful, wonderful experience. So I hope you have a blessed day, and hopefully I will be sharing more by way of videos or blog posts soon once our house gets a little bit back to normal. So, bye!